Okay, can we all get seated? It's already a little past 11, so we want to stay on time. Just briefly, my name is Serena Chen. I'm a professor and vice chair in psychology and also the faculty director of the Berkeley Collegium, a group of faculty who are very invested in teaching and other things related to undergraduate education here on campus. So the lightning panel of lightning talks I'll be moderating here. There's actually 5 speakers. The first 3 speakers, their talks will center around digital learning, and then the fourth and fifth speakers, the second group of speakers, are actually 2 former Distinguished Teaching Award recipients who will share with us some of their practices and approaches that they have found to be effective. And this will actually warm us up a bit for the lunchtime panel, which will feature this year's Distinguished Teaching Award recipients. So as a reminder, that's from 12 to 1. We're going to try to end this panel by 11:50 to give you 10 minutes to grab lunch to get ready to sit down again for the DTA, this year's DTA group. Okay, so our first 3 talks, again, all on digital learning. And actually, just quickly, the first 2 speakers of these 3, they are actually graduates of the Digital Pedagogy Fellows Program, which was first time started last year. It's offered again this year. If you want to learn more about it, there's these cute Yoda-type handout things, and Rita Conrad can tell you about it. Learning digital pedagogy techniques this summer. It's an online, self-paced sort of course with Rita, making sure that you finish it. But that's something, it starts soon, like May 14th, so if you want to get in on it, you need to do that soon. Okay, first up is Vesna Rodic from French, who will share with us her work on the topic of strategy for student engagement, 24 hours of French.
Thank you, Serena. So as Serena mentioned, I did this project as part of the, sorry, where's my,
just use the key.
The key, okay, thank you. As part of the work on, for the Digital Pedagogy Fellows Program, in which I redesigned a module from a course for intermediate French course in order to introduce a more systematic study of the French-English bilingual experience using technology. So what I was teaching was a cultural context that was largely unknown to my students, the bilingual experience in Canada. I have this text by French-Canadian author Gabrielle Roy, who speaks in an autobiographical manner about essentially the discrimination and the hardships that she faced as a French speaker in the Anglophone part of Canada. And this text is remarkably well written. It is clear, it is accessible, it is level appropriate for my students. It is beautifully matched with the grammatical structures of that module, which is a review of the past tenses. Yet when I would poll my students at the end of each semester about their least favorite and most enjoyable text to study, this text almost exclusively always made the least favorite list. And I could not figure out why. You know, my students in many ways are typical Berkeley students. Many of them speak another language. Many of them are connected to several other cultures through their background and experiences. A lot of them have studied abroad. Many of them are international students, and yet somehow they weren't connecting with this text. And over the years, I wondered about this, and I thought, well, maybe it's about the fact that we're here at Berkeley. If we were a school, say, in Buffalo, New York, or somewhere along the Canadian border, perhaps my students would have a better insight into the intricacies of this text described about the bilingual experience. And then a revolutionary thought occurred to me. What if it's not about geography? What if it was wrong of me to assume that a student at, say, SUNY Buffalo would know better about the French-Canadian experience than a Berkeley student would? And so keeping this in mind, I designed an assignment that asked my students to communicate for 24 hours in French. It was the beginning of a 3-day weekend, and I told my students that they would decide when the 24 hours started and that they would keep a log, a journal. They had to communicate in person. They had to switch all of their technology language to French, so their internet browser, the apps that they were receiving updates and news in, and they had to use social media. I asked them, give them a choice between Twitter and Facebook. They had to post and kind of keep being persistent on there. And so a number of things happened when we discussed this the following week. My students had a lot of assumptions about this assignment. A lot of them had interesting choices of technology, and then there were a number of follow-up unsolicited activities that they did as a result of this little experiment. And so some of them thought that it would be easier to do this in California if we were dealing with Chinese or Spanish. Would it be? I don't know. One student chose to put GPS in French, and then she was going to Tahoe, and there was a fair degree of miscommunication and confusion. Many of them withdrew and kind of became less engaged in their regular circles. Many of them found sort of impatience, and even, people were getting irate with them for insisting on French. And so, as I summed it up here, most of my students preferred communication online. Twitter was a little bit better than Facebook. Twitter allowed them to get information and exposure to information from the French-speaking world through the updates they otherwise wouldn't get. On Facebook, there was a fair degree of confusion and sort of impatience with their circle of friends. There's this translation option with Facebook that was giving their text directly in English, which also made it a little bit challenging. But this assignment ultimately allowed my students to connect better with the text that we studied. After they completed their journal, we went to the text. And as a result, their papers became more analytical. And so what I realized is that it wasn't about geography. It was the type of experience that my students had to live out through this experiential component and the use of technology. And I came to realize that for my students, the learning of French was a privilege. It was a positive thing. So what was challenging for them to see is that you could be discriminated against for using French. And so this is finally an invitation for you to see what is 24 hours in French to you, not just in terms of its equivalent in your field, but what kind of experience or assignment or a module would you want to introduce to have your students connect to the readings so that you give them in a more meaningful way. So thank you.
Thank you, Vesna. I think we're going to save questions until the end to see if we have time. Our second speaker in this panel is Crystal Cohen from Political Science and Global Studies. She's going to share with us her work on the topic, Approaches to Using Technology to Improve Student Engagement.
So this is very confusing for my students as well. I like to go by Crystal Chang, but in the system of Berkeley, I am now Crystal Cohen. So I tell all my female students, think twice before you change your name. I struggle with it every day. So I want to talk about student response systems. A lot of people have already talked about them today. I think what hopefully you get out of mind is what it looks like if you've never used some of these systems. So the two most popular ones, I think, are Top Hat and iClicker Reef, and I have piloted both. So I want to tell you how I think they can promote student engagement and accountability. So a little introduction to what these are. They're software applications that allow for real-time engagement and assessment in the classroom. They're free for instructors. iClicker Reef costs $15 for students. Top Hat costs $26 per semester, and that's irregardless of how many classes they take that semester. So if they're lucky enough to have a few classes, it still only costs them $15. But if you work with, and Judy in the back, she's the support person in ETS now, because ETS is supporting iClicker Cloud Reef, and that's important to know for your students and for instructors. So what can they do for me? First, they can automate tracking of attendance during every lecture. I think, as you heard earlier, we do think students learn more when they come to class. So it automates that, which is helpful. You don't have to pass around sign-in sheets and all these kind of ways that we try to do it. This is easier. They enable daily quizzing of readings and key concepts, and the iClicker Reef has this cool thing which is called an exit poll. So at the end of every session, when you close it, it can send an exit poll, which students can rank 1 to 5. How much did I understand the lecture today? And they can leave a little comment for you, like, I didn't understand this part of the history thing, which is kind of a cool thing to do. You don't have to do an exit poll, but I think it can be useful. And I actually do give quizzes every day. And I believe in points. I don't make it voluntary. Yes, it stresses them out, but I also feel like it makes them accountable. They actually do the reading before every class. And that wasn't true in the past. And I try to make the quiz questions, not too hard. And I actually, after the fact, I tell them if it was a question that more than 50% of the students got wrong, it turned out probably it was a bad question. So then you can change the number of points it's worth. But if I find that 80% of my students are getting it right, then it was probably a fair question. Of course, that's a little arbitrary, but every instructor can think about how to do that. I also use it as a way to wake up students. If I do have a lecture, I try to stop every few minutes, do a quick assessment. You can do a lot of things. It's actually not just quiz questions. You can ask what they think about a certain topic. You can get demographic information, as we saw with the biology class. There's a lot of things you can do. I also think it can broaden engagement, so I'm going to show you in a second. You can ask open-ended questions, and they're anonymous. So everybody has quiet students in their class and who don't want to raise their hand to speak up, but they obviously have something to say. So what they can do is type in a comment. You ask an open question, and everybody gets to participate. And then what I do is I scroll through, everyone sees it in real time, and I pick out those comments I think are really thoughtful. I'm like, oh, I really like this comment. This student shows something, and that student's quietly in the background going, oh, yeah, that's my comment. She thinks it's interesting. And then, that makes them feel like they're part of the conversation when they're not somebody who would speak up, which usually is 75% of the class. And it easily syncs with B courses. So this is a lower risk, I think more transparent way to grade participation, which is 20% of my syllabus grade. So this is like they can see throughout the semester how they're doing and how I'm, assessing them. And it's just a button you push. And iClicker Reef syncs with B courses. So that makes it much easier for me, where I'm not trying to give an arbitrary grade like, oh, I remember, Susie, she kind of said one or two things. I give her an 85%. This is like, okay, well, I can see how she's done over the semester. Did she come to class? Did she answer the questions correctly? Did she have some thoughtful things to say? It makes it much easier for me to do that assessment. What are the headaches? This is not a perfect system. It's a steep learning curve for instructors, but Judy can help you, and both of these programs, they want us to buy. They want us to convince our students to buy it, so they have a lot of support, and I think that it makes it easier for you to learn it. They're not that hard to learn, but it does require time. And it is a challenge for instructors with a strict no technology policy. I have a lot of colleagues who don't like students to have anything in class. This is challenging. They do have to have their phone or their tablet or their computer, and you have to be very thoughtful about how they're using it when they have to help you and not. I was just going to show you, this is what a question looks like. So this is just like where it says multiple choice. That's what the tool looks like. And then after, you can show the results. How many students answered each thing. This is what it looks like on their phone. Okay, so they pick an answer at the bottom, and they know when their answer's been received. And then this is the open-ended question, where this is iClicker Reef, and they can plug in a Twitter length thing, 140 characters, and they can like each other's or whatever, and that's how you can have a conversation. And just to tell you, when I did ask, so I used Top Hat in the past, but it's a similar type of tool, and I asked how many students did you attend more lectures because I was taking attendance? And basically over 80% of students said somewhat or very. Right? And then more importantly, did you do more of the readings? And also over 80% of students said, yes, they definitely did more of the readings than they would have otherwise done. So that's how I know I'm reaching my goals, which is they come to class and they're doing the readings. And I do have students who also write in comments that say, hey, you know what? It's cool. I feel like I'm part of the conversation even though I'm not speaking up. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to our third digital learning talk. I think we're going to hear more about clickers. We have Robin Ball from MCB who's going to share with us her work on the topic, getting more clicks out of clickers.
That's right. Another talk about clickers. They're not paying us for this promotion. Yes, I'm a lecturer in the molecular and cell biology department. And as you heard, clickers are very useful to get students to come to class and participate. I have felt a little bit limited by the remote control clickers because you're limited to multiple choice questions. And the students really are just talking to the person next to them who is probably just their friend who they came to class with. So I'm going to talk about two ways that I've used clickers and kind of a different way to get more interaction in the class. That's my title slide. Okay, so the first way is my introductory human physiology course. There's about 400 students in this class, and a lot of them are pre-med, and so they really want to hear about real life patient cases. And so for this particular unit on brain anatomy, I used to teach it just by doing a lecture. Like, here's the brain, let's label the parts of it. And I got really bored doing that. So in the last 2 years, I've done a case study competition. So I have a worksheet that has 5 case studies on it with real patients. These are their symptoms. What do you think is wrong with the brain? And then I separate the class into 5 groups based on where the aisles are in our classroom, which was 2050 VLSB. Each group is assigned one case study to work on. And then after they've discussed it with their group, then they're given a clicker question, such as this. So group 1, where has the damage occurred? And then they have to put in their answer. And the motivation here is that the group that has the highest percentage correct for their clicker question gets half of a extra credit point, which is not that much, but it's enough to get the students motivated, and it's a competition. And so they don't know what the case study question is going to be exactly, and so they really need to like get up out of their seat, talk to other people in their area, it could be 80 people in their group, and make sure that everyone really understands the biology behind the case study so that they can answer their clicker question correctly. So it's definitely a good way of getting interaction with the students. But then is it an effective way to teach brain anatomy? So to look at that, I analyzed exam questions that I've given related to brain anatomy. And in 2014 and 15, I just did it lecture-based style. Already the students were doing pretty well, so they got like 70 to 80% of those questions correct. And then when I did case studies in the last 2 years, it's about the same. So there's no statistical significance between the two groups. They are learning brain anatomy just as well. The light purple questions are actual case studies that were on the exam, so I can kind of ask more complicated questions. So it is an effective way to teach brain anatomy. And then I asked the students where they thought it was effective, and the majority of them did think it was effective. Asked them if they had fun discussing it, and they did. And then they also asked to do more case study competitions in the future. So I've designed it for the reproductive system, kidney function, and the digestive system. So it's been pretty great way to get more interaction in my large lecture. So then the second way that I've been using clickers, which actually is exactly what Crystal was talking about, I was piloting the new iClicker Cloud app this semester. So this is an app that students can get on their phone or their laptop. And I was using it in upper division neuroscience courses. These are smaller classes. And I really liked it because I could ask more complex questions because they can text in their answer, as we heard. And for my particular case here, since I was just piloting it, I didn't have points associated with it. But students still used it. I'd say the majority of them who came to class were involved in this. And so this is an example of a question I might ask them. This is for an upper division high-level disease class. So what should you look for to determine if this person had Alzheimer's disease or chronic traumatic encephalopathy? At this point, the students have learned about Alzheimer's disease already, but they're kind of trying to think about applying that to other diseases and what the differences might be. And then on my screen, as they're typing in their answers, I can see those responses in real time. I know you can't read this, but these are the examples of what I'm seeing. And so as it's coming up, I'm looking for wrong answers and misconceptions so that I can address those after we're done. And then I'm also looking for correct answers. So this particular question has multiple correct answers, and some students did say those correct answers. And so then I can read them out to the class. And as Crystal was saying, I feel like it's a good way of bringing voice to more students rather than just having the same like 3 or 4 people answer all of my questions. And it worked really well in a small class. In a large lecture where you're getting like 400 of these responses, I'm not sure. That might be a little overwhelming, but it worked out really well in this class. Yeah, so I think that's it. Thanks.
Moving into the last 2 talks in this panel, these are really lightning. We have our 2 former DTA recipients. First, we have Dan Feldman, also from MCB. He's going to share with us his work on the topic Structural Discussion of Scientific Research Papers.
All right, thank you. So, in biology and science, we try to teach multiple different levels of information. We teach facts, we teach concepts about how your favorite part of the body or the physical world works. But we also want students to teach about scientific reasoning, evidence, how to think at multiple levels about these problems. And with multiple years of teaching, what I found is that it's not hard to find a format that conveys the facts and the concepts. It's not that hard to test them. We can all kind of improve on this. I think we're hearing a lot of very, very good advice about how to do this. But one particular challenge that I found, particularly in the large lecture format, is how to get students to really think about the nature of evidence, the nature of reasoning, and get them to reason themselves. And so quite a few years ago, I tried to come up with a structure that would work for this, that could be integrated into large classes. And I'm going to tell you a bit about this. I don't have slides. I'm just going to talk. I apologize. And the topic that I've been applying this to is the topic of the neurobiology of behavior. This is understanding how cells and brain circuits in the brain work together, process information in order to be able to go from some sensory input, generate our rich perceptual world, generate our motor output, do interesting things like mediate learning and memory and emotion, attention, things like that, but in a very quantitative way. So how do we teach this? In the MCB department, we have a class, MCB 160, which is a broad fact and concept-based survey of the brain from cells up to complex systems. And this is a large class, about 200 students. The next class up for many years was a class called MCB 167, which is the one that I'll talk about. And this was a smaller class of about 75 students. And the goal here was to teach again these same ideas, but now really get the students to think about how this works mechanistically and how they can reason with it. And the method that we chose to get this across was to do a combination of class would have 2 meetings a week. One meeting was a sort of discussion-based lecture, but it was really primarily a lecture where they read a textbook chapter beforehand. And then the second meeting was entirely different. The students were assigned primary papers from the scientific literature, ones that were carefully chosen to be accessible, but yet still challenging. These are modern, complicated, challenging papers. And we had to come up with a format to get the students to think and reason with this information to figure out how biological ideas originated, how they're tested. And so what we did was we would assign the paper, we would write and assign a reading guide to go with it, which would explain in just a page or so whatever background information that they might not have been in the lecture that they needed to process that paper. And it would also give a set of discussion questions about the paper that students had to write out, 3 questions, let's say a paragraph each. A couple of them were factual, what did they do, how did they test it? A couple of them were interpretational, what do you think this means? Let me tell you about a new experiment. Why do you think that that was the result? What result would you predict? And students would write out these answers and they would come to discussion section, the second meeting of the week, which was run by the professors, not GSIs, in order to discuss this. So as an instructor, I would attend actually both the discussion sections. This is not the normal thing in MCB, but this worked very well. And we would divide the class into half so that now we had about 35 or 40 students in each group. And this worked incredibly well. What we would do is have a very structured discussion based on those responses that they gave. I would ask leading questions. Students would pop up their hands. I told them from the very beginning, I'm going to call on everybody in the room. People will be shy. Don't worry. There's no bad, answer. And over a few weeks of the class, we would go from the typical situation of 25% of the students being happy to participate to really by the end, I think about 80% of students being happy to participate and everybody participating at some level. One key aspect of this is several points during each meeting. We would divide up into small groups of 5 or 6 students who would internally discuss some of those questions for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we would rejoin as a whole class. Each group would elect a representative within the group to raise their hand and talk about the group's consensus that they came up for the questions, and by surveying across the groups, you come up with consensus areas. So this worked incredibly well for a class of this size. I'm talking about this in the past tense because we've reorganized the classes in MCB. Now the neuro classes are quite a bit bigger. They're 200 students each. I unfortunately cannot figure out how to run this sort of discussion with more than about 40, 45 students in it, but we are working on sort of new applications. Let me tell you a little bit about what I think some of the outcomes were for this. I don't have quantitative results, but I'll just give you my qualitative findings. So we did this for 7 years. I think it was incredibly effective, judged by a few things. First, I'm used to, in these upper division classes, about the top half of the class really being very good conceptually and the other half of the class pulling themselves along. And here, really, the vast majority of students really had a great mastery of the material based on their performance in exams and discussions. But to me, that's not the most telling thing. The most telling thing is what would happen in office hours. We're used to office hours where 20 students, 15 students might show up, and they ask very factual questions about something that they missed for that week. What's going to be on the exam? How do I prepare for the exams? What happened during these discussion sections is that many students, even the ones quiet in the back, who had interesting angles and grasp of the material, which wouldn't normally come out in a lecture exam kind of format, they became emboldened to really think much more creatively about these topics because they've wrestled with a very hard scientific paper and yet they've pulled important things out of it and made important links. And so the office hours were huge. I'd get 1/3 of the students coming to office hours. We would spend at least half of the time in office hours talking about general, wide-ranging questions the students would bring up, not about the topics specifically in class, but about how they're related to other aspects of biology, societal issues, disease, whatever interested them, and we'd had great discussions. And at the end of all of this, over multiple years, I had many students coming to me and saying that they were very excited by this class. It inspired them to go more deeply into science or into neuroscience in many cases, because they now felt like they knew how to think, or at least how to approach thinking about these issues. So that's my experience. I want to roll it out to a bigger class. I would love to learn how, hopefully from you guys.
Okay, last but not least for this panel, we have Adhikari from Statistics, who will share with us her work on the topic Towards Understanding.
Hi, everybody. I teach statistics, data science. Many of my classes involve quite a bit of calculation. There is obviously a self-selected group that comes to such a major. Many of them have come to this major because they like to compute. And one of the things that I've tried to do over the years is see what it means to them to understand something. And so I'd like to talk about my good fortune in having learned from the best. I was a graduate student here. This is David Blackwell. We have just named our newest dorm after him. And he told me when I was a graduate student, Ani, you haven't understood a theorem in probability until you can explain it in terms of a sequence of tosses of a coin. And I would just like to say to David, wherever he happens to be, that I'm still working on that. But what it taught me at a very young age was that it is important to get to the essence. And that the essence isn't in the specific conditions under which the theorem is true or in the specific formula. There is something else that has happened there. And what we'd love to do is to have our students work towards that level of understanding. So over the years, I've tried to make a collection of what students tell me, the words that they use when they try to explain what they are not understanding. And one of the things I've noticed is that the agent has changed. In the 1980s, when I started out as a teaching assistant, I would get a lot of I don't understand. Slowly that drifted into it's confusing, so that the problem is with whatever they're being faced with. And now it's flat out, this is terrible. Okay. But I've tried to glean from it, what can I get from this? What is the student telling me? And one very common response that I have got over the years is the student telling me what the problem is. And they start out rather gloriously. I understand everything is the first part of their sentence, right? But of course there's a catch. And now the issue is when it comes to doing the problems, the key, I get thrown by the wording, okay? And so this is very helpful to me, actually. Now, I have to set aside the image that I have in my head. You knew words were powerful. What you did not know is that they're flinging our students all about. And so walking away from that mental image, I have to look at what the student feels. The student sees the words as obstacles. And this is partly due to the students that I get who have often done mathematics in a way that consists of essentially moving glyphs around on a page, recognizing a pattern of glyphs here and trying to reproduce that pattern of glyphs here. But we all know that there is no understanding, whether you're David Blackwell or in 4th grade, without words. And they are seeing the words as the obstacle, but the words are actually what they need to use. And so my job is, and for me, an intimate class is 400 people. My job is to get the students to see the words as something, that's where the power is. And so what I try to do is to get the students to use the words. And so in every class, I should say almost every class. If I have time, I'll explain the almost. I start, whether it's a graduate class or a freshman class, I will start with the same question. What did we do last time? And in the early weeks, there is horror among the students. The professor doesn't even know what we did last time. But after a while, they catch on. They catch on what their job is. And their job is to collaborate in real time by speaking to come up with an answer. and there are rules for the answer. It must be a couple of sentences, 3 at the most. It must describe the main point of the previous lecture. There's rarely more than one main point if I look back. Maybe there's 2. And the key is no jargon, no formulas. Tell me what happened. So here's how this goes. So I start out, so what happened last time? And somebody from the corner will shout out N choose K, and by that time enough people will say binomial, because they know I'm not going to like the N choose K, right? So they're going to say binomial. And I say, great, somebody translate that into English, please. And then there's a little silence, and somebody says, successes, terrific. So now I start writing on the board. I write the word successes. Okay, create a sentence. The trials are independent, fantastic. So we have independent trials. Where does this go? And we just work through this process with people shooting out suggestions from here and there until we have a couple of sentences that read something like this. Suppose we have a trial that results only in success or failure, and we repeat this trial independently under the same conditions a known number of times. Last time we figured out how to find the chance of getting a specified number of successes. And now they have a way to understand the binomial formula. And so it's not n choose k, p to the k, 1 minus p to the n minus k. Everybody can do that, right? This was what they needed. And this, I find, has been remarkably helpful for students in a number of ways. Like Dan, I don't have quantitative data. I'm the data scientist. But I will just report my anecdotal evidence over the years. Okay, this increases understanding, and I will give you some evidence for why this is. The main thing is it forces the students to get away from the formula, and there is less trouble with the words. So I get questions about how to do the problems in office hours, and there are discussions on the online talk boards. But it's not what the words mean. So that is important. The words matter, and the students own the description, right? They have created the words. It's not something extra I've asked them to read. Students are rather, I have found increasingly that they are more numerate in terms of being able to move the glyphs around, but they are quite resentful about having to read. Fine, I get them to write. So they create this description. It increases engagement in multiple ways, one of which is watching their fellow students come up with all this and trying to collectively get something going by themselves, and just having me more or less be an MC and a scribe. That is helpful. I don't have numerical data, but I have one piece of evidence that I feel just shows that it's the students telling me this is helpful. They show up. They show up at the start of class and they don't dribble in 10 minutes later, right? The whole class is there at the beginning because they know something good is going to happen in those first couple of minutes. And this is a recognition from the students that this matters. Another recognition was when I started putting the sentences on the web and gave the students credit who participated. That was crazy. It was hard for me with 400 people to figure out what the names were. But it wouldn't stop coming because they wanted their families to see their name on the class website. Now, I have 1,000 students now. I haven't dared. So I don't quite know how to MC the 1,000, but I'm working on it, and I'll get there. Regardless, even when I don't do it in class, I do it for myself. Every single lecture, why am I asking these students to spend 50, 80 minutes with me? What is the point? And I found that this helps me, and I think it also helps the students. Thank you.
Okay, we have at least 10, 12 minutes for questions, so I think we're going to do what we did for the last panel. If you have questions, if you could come up here so that speaker like me or that speaker? Got it. Okay. So questions.
The question is, how long does the activity take? 3 minutes, maybe. fewer than 5. I've got stuff to teach. But fewer than 5. That's one of my reasons for being a little nervous with 1,000 students. But we're working on it.
It seems like a lot of the discussion today is revolved around scale and our large classrooms. And maybe it's a question for Robin. The use of clickers, there are pros and cons to, having students using electronic devices in classes. But what about the idea of perhaps repeating a lecture so there's a smaller class and students feel more identifying with their classmates, as opposed to always solving problems because our faculty don't want to teach very large classes more than once?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just not the space for that, to have so many classes. I mean, I have 400 students in my class, so does that mean there should be 10 versions of it that are 40 students each or so? I don't know. I just don't think it works with the UC Berkeley, trying to get as many students here as possible. But do you have another idea? Or, okay. I don't know. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? I mean, I think it'd be nice. It definitely would be nice. And I guess maybe the discussion sections are a way that we can work kind of more one-on-one with the students, and they can feel like, they're valued and we know their name and so on. Yeah, it's a good point.
Did the average grade change? I haven't tracked that. I would say probably no. But I will say that, the exams are, they're sort of evenly weighted from these facts to this sort of, more scientific evidence concept level. And I think one benefit of this teaching strategy is it does put much more emphasis on the reasoning. Actually, this comes up a little bit related to this issue of words, being afraid about words. Another motivation for this class. I feel at least, in biology, and this may be true in other sciences, our students graduate sometimes being able to learn facts very effectively, but being able to express themselves and their ideas very poorly. And when we grade the exams, I think we're often very generous about giving people credit for the concepts and words they state without really thinking about how well are they expressing themselves and their ideas. And so another benefit of having this structured discussion, exactly as Ani was saying, is that ideas have to be put into, concrete sentences and paragraphs. And people in biology students who may not realize this coming in, I think are forced to realize that it doesn't just take a sentence to express something important. It takes a paragraph that's organized and has logical flow and thought and conclusion, and they need to learn to think that way. So in that sense, I did think it improved the performance quite a bit.
So the students are better qualified, but they're not getting better grade.
I think that's a fair summary, yeah.
Kind of on that same idea, did you hear better outcomes, and I think this is for several people, downstream of your course? Like normally before, when it was very fact-based or just testing based, you have certain outcomes and they go downstream to these upper revision courses. Did you hear any feedback that the students that came out of this changed course were performing?
That doesn't apply so much to this course because this was a senior year course, but it's very specialized, but maybe in the other cases.
There was one occasion where we tracked what happened in Stat 135 to the students who had taken different 134s. And there was, I don't think there was any separation of exactly what in the different 134s was making the difference. So I don't think I can answer that question sharply. Again, from a practical perspective, it's the students' responses when they graduate. They stand up and they say things at graduation, and they say which were the courses that set them on their path. These courses are almost always mentioned, but I don't know that it is because of this particular intervention. I don't know. It could just be the subject matter. I don't know.
Okay, so the question was about using clickers kind of in a more creative way, or to get students to think differently.
Sort of what we heard in the second two talks with your talks.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think being able to write in the answer, like using the app, was helpful because you could definitely. I mean, it's kind of the same thing that they're talking about. You're getting students to use words and to write their answers succinctly. They only have a limited amount of space. I don't know. Do you have anything to add?
The other, I don't know if it's creative, but another thing that I do that I really like is, so they have these individual questions for which they're individually assessed. But then I usually have one maybe hard or more thought-provoking question, and then I say, with your table mates, so I teach in this very cool room that has tables, I say, talk about it with each other, and then come up with the answer. You know, so at least it's generating some discussion, and then they can come up with some answer, or like, what did you learn from that experience talking to others? And they can type in an answer. So it's not exactly creative, but it can be collaborative. And I think the way Robin does her case studies, I think that's very creative, actually, is, again, increasing engagement.
Right. Yeah, you can also ask questions that don't necessarily have a right answer.
That's
where
right.
All of them are, valid, and they need to kind of express their viewpoint to justify their answer.
Just as a follow-up, Crystal, I think
Yeah.
you showed that typing in the open-ended and that you could see them, but can everyone?
Yeah, everyone sees them real time. And it's cool because even if it's in a big classroom, they can see them on their phone and they can scroll through them. And in Top Hat, I mean, it's a little risky because students could write something, but you can track.
You can also
You can
block that
ultimately-
function. That's what I did. So they were not seeing their answers.
Oh, yeah, you can block it. But once you've set the rules, it is fun. Students like to see what other students think. Especially, so you can ask, what do you think questions, right? It's not some numeric question, but how did you feel about the outcome of this court case? And people can answer that very honestly and in a way where they can be heard, but not identified if they don't want to be identified. In the different platforms have different ways of anonymity. So you can have complete anonymity and you can tell the students, even I won't know who wrote this. Or in Top Hat, there's an anonymity like the students can't see who wrote it, but I ultimately can see. So there's different levels of accountability there, but it can be very creative. And it can generate a lot of discussion. I mean, I did do that open-ended discussion for 150 students, which seems a little bit crazy, but then I said, go through and like the ones that, and then what happens is it populates the most liked ones to the top, and then we can talk about that. Why did most students like this comment? What does it mean? And I learn a lot from that myself, because, again, in 150 students, how can you know what the majority of students feel? I don't teach numbers classes, so it's all about sort of thinking about different issues. What do they really think? And it's like, oh my gosh, how interesting. I would have never known the majority of students think this. This is a very good question about technology failure. So in the beginning of this semester, there was a huge Wi-Fi crisis, and it torpedoed my pilot. So yes, that can happen. And the other, I didn't want to make my font too small, but there are other challenges of these things, which when you make them part of their grade, then there is some technology snafu, and it does require a lot of sort of amending on my end. Oh my gosh, Professor Chang, my phone didn't work today, and then blah, 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 and then I have to field that. So there is that you have to deal with. But the technology is forgiving, like you can go and amend their points and things like that. And Top Hat has a cool function where you can actually, if the student has an excused absence, for example, you can actually assign the questions from that day to them to do individually, and they can still get credit on their own time. Does that make sense? iClicker Reef, you can't do that, but I really like that about Top Hat. And the other thing about iClicker Reef, if you're interested, is they even have a geospatial, what do they call it? Like the geo-tracking location. So you can set a location so that if you have a big class, Bobby can't tell Susie like, oh, you're at home, but she turned it on now, so you can get on and answer the questions. You actually have to have your device within the building. I didn't use that, but because my class is small, but I think for big classes, it's an interesting idea.
Last question.
How do you deal with students who don't have smartphones?
Well, mine wasn't graded, so it didn't matter. But you can use tablet, a laptop. You could get them a very cheap smartphone without a plan. Yeah, or clicker.
Oh, they rent smartphones?
Tablets.
Oh yeah, you can rent laptops for sure. Here's the other interesting thing. Actually, it's hard to find a student who doesn't have a phone at all. But both of the Top Hat and iClicker platforms, you can actually participate with, believe it or not, an old style phone that's not smart. It can SMS. That's what I meant to say. I haven't actually run into that, but they are enabled for that. So if you have somebody who doesn't have that. But yeah, I mean, usually students have something, a laptop, a tablet, a phone.
Okay, well, thank you, speakers.